In 1981, the British band Japan released what many listeners now consider their greatest album. Tin Drum was elegant, atmospheric, and unlike anything else in the British New Wave and New Romantic era at the time. The music was sparse and refined. Synthesizers drifted through the songs like distant landscapes, while Mick Karn's distinctive fretless bass seemed to glide rather than play. It sounded like a band that had finally discovered exactly who they were. After years of struggling to find a large audience, Japan were finally beginning to break through. But instead of building on that success, the band made a surprising decision. Within a year of releasing Tin Drum, Japan would no longer exist. This is the story of Tin Drum, the album that became Japan's creative peak and their final chapter as a band. To understand Tin Drum, it helps to go back a few years. When Japan first appeared in the mid-1970s, they looked very different from the band that would later record this album. Their early records, Adolescent Sex and Obscure Alternatives, were heavily influenced by glam rock and the theatrical style of artists like David Bowie and Roxy Music. At the time, the band were still searching for a clear musical identity. Although those early albums contained interesting moments, they struggled commercially, and critics often dismissed the group as another glam-influenced act arriving too late to the scene. But by the end of the decade, something important began to change. With the 1979 album Quiet Life, Japan began to move away from their earlier sound. The music became more atmospheric, more elegant, and increasingly shaped by synthesizers and a more refined continental style. The transformation continued with Gentlemen Take Polaroids in 1980. That album pushed further into synthesizers and more sophisticated songwriting, but it still felt like a band in transition. The direction was becoming clearer, yet the full identity of Japan had not completely settled. It was the next album that would bring all of these elements together. By the time work began on Tin Drum in 1981, Japan had evolved into something quite unique. The album was produced by Steve Nye, who had previously worked with artists like Roxy Music and also collaborated with John Foxx. Nye understood how to create space within electronic arrangements, something that suited Japan perfectly at this stage of their development. Rather than filling the music with layers of instruments, the production focused on clarity and atmosphere. Each sound was carefully placed within the mix, allowing the individual musicians to interact in subtle ways. The result was music that felt both minimal and incredibly detailed at the same time. This approach reflected the band's growing confidence. Japan were no longer trying to imitate their influences. Instead, they had developed a sound that felt entirely their own. Much of the character of Tin Drum came from the individual musicians within the band. Mick Karn's fretless bass had become one of Japan's most distinctive elements. Rather than simply supporting the rhythm, Karn played the bass almost like a melodic instrument. His sliding notes created a fluid and slightly unpredictable quality that became central to the band's sound. Richard Barbieri's synthesizers added another layer of atmosphere. Instead of dominating the arrangements, the keyboards often functioned like shifting backgrounds, creating mood and texture rather than obvious melodies. The synthesizers drift through the music in subtle waves, giving the album its spacious and cinematic quality. Steve Jansen's drumming was equally restrained. His playing is precise but never intrusive, often leaving large spaces between the beats. Rather than pushing the songs forward aggressively, Jansen allows the music to breathe. At the center of it all was David Sylvian. By this stage, Sylvian had become the band's primary lyricist and one of the main creative forces behind their direction. His vocal style had changed significantly since the earlier albums, Instead of theatrical delivery, he now sang in a quieter and more introspective tone that suited the atmosphere of the music perfectly. Together, these elements created an album that feels both minimal and richly detailed. Another striking feature of Tin Drum was the band's fascination with East Asian culture. This interest had been part of Japan's aesthetic for some time, but on Tin Drum it became particularly noticeable in both the imagery and the music. The lyrics also reflected Sylvian's growing fascination with Asian imagery and landscapes. Musically, the band were not attempting to recreate traditional Asian music. Instead, they created a stylized interpretation that blended Western electronic textures with melodic ideas and tonal colors that hinted at Eastern influences. This combination gave the album a mysterious and slightly otherworldly atmosphere, at a time when the new wave and new romantic scene was full of creative energy. Tin Drum still stood apart for its quiet restraint and distinctive atmosphere. One of the album's most recognizable tracks is Visions of China. The song combines a strong rhythmic structure with atmospheric synthesizers and Karn's distinctive bass lines. It captures many of the elements that define the album, balancing accessibility with a slightly experimental edge. Another interesting moment on the record is Cantonese Boy. Here the band explore a slightly more playful energy while still maintaining the elegant restraint that runs throughout the album. The rhythmic phrasing and melodic structure hint again at the band's fascination with Asian musical ideas, while still remaining firmly within their own distinctive sound. These songs demonstrate how Japan were able to explore different moods without disrupting the carefully constructed atmosphere of the album. Perhaps the most remarkable song on the album is Ghosts. The track is extremely minimal. There are no drums, and the arrangement moves slowly and delicately around Sylvian's fragile vocal. The music feels almost suspended in time. Despite its unusual structure, Ghosts became a major hit in Britain, reaching the top 5. At a time when much of the music in the new wave and new romantic scene was driven by strong rhythms and synthesizer hooks, this quiet and introspective song resonated deeply with listeners. Its success demonstrated just how far Japan had moved from their earlier sound. Yet while the band were creating some of their most refined music, the internal dynamics of Japan were beginning to change. By this point, David Sylvian had become the central creative voice within the group. At the same time, the other members were developing their own musical interests and artistic directions. The collaboration within the band still worked beautifully on Tin Drum, but it was becoming clear that the members were beginning to imagine different creative futures. In many ways, the album represents the moment when everything Japan had been developing finally came together, but it also marked a turning point for the band itself. What makes the story of Tin Drum particularly unusual is what happened next. By the time the album was released, Japan were finally receiving the recognition they had been chasing for years. Their audience was growing, and their music was attracting increasing critical attention. For most bands, this would have been the moment to continue forward and build on that success. Instead, Japan made the decision to bring the band to an end. It was a surprising choice, especially considering that the group had just produced their most refined and distinctive work. Looking back today, Tin Drum stands as one of the most remarkable albums of the early 1980s. Its elegant arrangements, atmospheric production, and unusual musicianship continue to influence artists decades later. For Japan, the album represented the culmination of a long creative journey. Everything the band had been searching for finally came together, and perhaps that is why Tin Drum feels like such a perfect ending. It was not simply another album in their catalogue, it was the final statement of a band that had spent years evolving into something truly unique.